Part of your learning is to hear how other people conduct appraisal discussions. So I'd like you to listen to the upcoming discussion. This is a demonstration, and because of that, I'd like you to keep in mind a few things. Specifically, this is going to be shorter than it would be in real life. In real life, most of these conversations will run somewhere between 30 and 45 minutes, depending upon the content and how much you have to cover. Because this is a demonstration, we're not going to cover every element, but give you an idea of what the conversation may sound like at certain points. What you're going to hear is a smooth sailing conversation. Those are the types of appraisal discussions most of us have. Sometimes we get into conversations that we would call rough sailing. People have resistance and they have concerns. That's not what we're demonstrating here. So you will hear people who are, in general, on the same page. This demonstration assumes that there's been some history between the individuals and you don't have access to all of that history. But in general, they've got a good relationship and they've been meeting one-on-one at least monthly. Don't pay attention to my style. Style isn't as important because you'll use your style. And the content that we'll be using is generic. That's just so that it can apply to everybody and be used as an example that we can all relate to. So that being the case, what is it that I want you to listen and take notes on? A few things. What did I cover in the opening of the discussion? We believe that the opening of an appraisal discussion really sets the tone for the way that the discussion is going to run. So pay close attention to that. How did I make the conversation two-way? And then as you think through the discussion, what kind of preparation was I likely to have done ahead of time? Some of that you're going to be able to tell just from the conversation. Let's get started. Kayla, thank you for meeting with me today.
Yes, no problem.
As I mentioned, I'd like to spend the next 30 minutes or so discussing your performance review. Is this still a good time for you?
Yes, this is fine.
First, let's talk about your thoughts on how the year has gone, and then I can provide some feedback to you. Since we've been touching base every month, there shouldn't be any surprises, but this will formalize things between us. Then we can speak about future goals and set some follow-up. How does that sound to you?
Sounds great.
I've had a look at the notes that you gave to me, and that was very helpful. Well, tell me, what are some of the things that you felt went particularly well for you this year?
Sure. Well, back in the fall, I was very pleased that even though the requirements continually shift with the customer and then with trouble we had with getting others to meet deadlines, we still were able to bring the development of the new program in on budget. So I was really happy about that.
And you really like the fact that in the midst of all that chaos, you could still manage to get it in and get it in on budget.
Yes, very much so.
I think that's a recurring theme with a lot of our customers. They want more and faster and cheaper. Was there anything that you would have changed or liked to do differently during the year?
I think my follow-up to get decisions from clients could have been a bit more consistent. I did follow up, but sometimes I may have been a little bit too lax with the time I spent checking in. Like I might have waited too long, whereas others, it was a consistent, timely matter before I checked in. So I probably should have been a little bit more consistent with the time that I was checking in.
Yeah, so it didn't necessarily, you may have planned to check in, but didn't necessarily happen as quickly as you would have liked.
Right.
Okay. Okay. Well, I think we see things pretty similarly, maybe just a few differences. So why don't I share with you some of what I noticed that really stood out for me as being key to this year's performance. Would that work for you?
Sure, I like that.
Okay. So one of the things that you mentioned already that I also thought went very well was related to this idea of initiative and problem solving, and specifically on the software development project. You know, we are always striving to keep the documentation of customer requirements up to date so that we've got the history. And every time I went in and checked the log, you had handled it. And that made it really easy for me to see what had been agreed and not agreed as far as changes to the project scope. So I think for sure that was one of the things that helped, as you mentioned, keep things on budget. You were keeping track of it, and therefore we could actually increase the budget where we needed or scale back in other areas. So that worked exceptionally well, and I thought it was a great example of you taking initiative and problem solving and accountability.
Well, thank you.
One area that you didn't mention that I noticed that came up during the year was around this idea of work habits and, in particular, cooperation. I noticed that you didn't always include Chris in the project meetings when it would have been useful and sometimes appropriate to do that. An example that comes to mind and that I made a note of here was when you were setting up the meeting to develop the pilot rollout. Because Chris wasn't involved in that meeting, I received a lot of questions from his team, and then I noticed that you ended up anyway having to go back and hold another meeting so that they were informed. One of my concerns was that that might have created some confusion and delays, and it certainly meant that you had to have extra meetings, which are never a lot of fun. Did
Mhm.
you see that the same way?
No, I don't. I don't think at first I saw it that way. I didn't wasn't intentionally leaving him out. I thought it would be best to work with just a few at the beginning to start, and then kind of fan out as more development was needed. So I wasn't really doing it to leave him out or to cause confusion down the road.
Got it. Right. So it wasn't something that was intentional on your part.
Right.
Because of this, and I'm glad we had this conversation, your performance rating this year will be exceed expectations. That really means that most of the time and almost always you were above what would have been expected of somebody with your tenure in this position and with these objectives. So I really appreciate that. How does that sound to you?
Thank you. That's very wonderful. I appreciate that.
So, Kayla, as we plan for the next review period, we want to build upon what's really working well, and there's a lot there. I have some thoughts, but wanted to get your point of view first.
Okay.
Knowing our goals and our targets for the department, what are one or two things you see that would be important for your role?
I definitely think, like I said, finding consistency with my follow-up
Mm-hmm.
and making sure I'm inclusive of our entire team, playing on their strengths to not only be more efficient, but make sure the team feels included as well.
Yeah, great. So, really looking at how do we best cooperate and make sure that we're thinking ahead as to who needs to be involved.
Yes.
Okay. Well, let me just make a note of that and we can come back to that at one of our touch space and flesh that out a little bit more.
Okay.
One thing that I for sure want to include in your targets is giving you an opportunity to get some more exposure to some of the key decision makers in the organization. I would love for you to be able to take on a more visible role around, in particular, how we're setting up timing and action plans for some of these upcoming projects. So I'd like to talk with you a little bit more about how we can make that happen and what projects it may make sense to do that on.
Okay. Thank you.
So far, how comfortable are you in what we've agreed to? Does it sound like we're on track? Is there anything we haven't discussed that you think would be important for me to know?
No, I think what we've covered is great and a good place for me to go from here.
Great. Well, I just want to say, I know that doing a performance review is sometimes something already on a full plate, and I really appreciate the time that we've had to talk through this in some more detail. I want to set up our next touch base meeting so that we can stay connected on how things are going. I think we've been pretty good at meeting at least once a month just to check in. And in the meanwhile, so that you're aware, the next steps in the performance review process are to have you sign the appraisal, and then I will be submitting that along with any information on salary changes.
Okay.
So thank you again for the discussion, Kayla. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate these meetings and they're very insightful for me.